Good evening, everybody. Happy to have you at our home away from home at TVO, the Munk School of Global Affairs, here on the downtown campus of the University of Toronto, where on the final Thursday of every month for the last 10 years, we've been coming here to do special broadcasts, mostly about foreign affairs, and that's where we're going tonight. We're live streaming this on our homepage, tvo.org/theagenda, on our Facebook page as well, facebook.com/theagenda, and we have a lot of ways for you to get involved in our broadcast as we do every Thursday. You can join our live chat. Mike Miner, our fifth column blogger, is moderating that chat. He's on our Inside Agenda Producers blog at tvo.org/theagenda, and again on the Facebook page as well. Also, you can send us a tweet at twitter.com, #youragenda. So please jump in and join our discussion, and we want to remind you as well that once we're finished with the television broadcast at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, we flip over to the web exclusively, and for 10 or 15 minutes or so, we'll take your comments, your questions for our guests on tonight's topic. You can log in right now at tvo.org/theagenda and start submitting your comments and questions. Now, joining us this evening at the Munk School, Ron Christie, Republican strategist and a former special assistant to President George W. Bush. Arnie Arneson, host of Political Chowder in New Hampshire, where she was once a member of the Granite State's House of Representatives. Theo Caldwell, the author and columnist with the National Post and Sun Media, and Janice Stein, TVO's foreign affairs analyst and director of this Munk School. Good to have everybody here. We've all been together on our program before, but usually in 3 or 4 different locations, so It's really a delight to have you all here under Professor Stein's roof for this important discussion, I think, about what's going on with the American electorate. Arnie, to you first. Is the atmosphere that we are seeing in your country right now simply in keeping with America's boisterous political, cultural past?
Oh, I think it's boisterous on steroids right about now. I was trying to figure out how I would describe what it feels like this time. And a friend of mine used to do an editing for a governing magazine. And he said all campaigns could be dumbed down to 2 sentences. Me, citizen, him, crook. And I thought, yeah, he's right. This time it feels a little bit different. Me, patriot, him, socialist. And that's really what's happening. And so it's intensified in a way I have never, ever seen before. And there may be a lot of reasons for it, but I actually go to 2 decisions by the Supreme Court that feel like bookends, that have sort of set the stage for this. The first, 10 years ago, Bush v. Gore. The next, Citizens United in 2010. And those 2 decisions really have infected the political landscape in a way that, on top of the economy, on top of the war, on top of 9/11, have really changed the political conversation in this country.
Let's see if Ron agrees with, I think everybody's agreed to the fact that the American electorate is angry, and perhaps unprecedented in our sort of lifetimes or following all of this. Why? We want to get to. Ron, what would you say?
Well, I agree with a little bit of what Arnie had to say, but I think it goes a lot deeper than that. I think that the American electorate, if you look back to 1994, when the Republicans had been out of power for over 40 years, and there was a sense that the government had gotten away from the people. The government was no longer responsive. The government was no longer engaged with the people. And in that particular election, you had 52 Republicans who came to Washington. And now I think the climate is entirely different. Now it's just not that the Democrats are out of control. It's not that the Republicans are out of control. They think Washington is now out of control. Washington is no longer responsive. And I think what you've seen now is a groundswell of organic political distress. People saying, I want them all out. It's not just the Republicans, it's not just the Democrats. So where I take exception is that it's not just Citizens United in the case dealing specifically with campaign finance.
Take 30 seconds and tell us what that was.
Sure. Citizens United, it was about a documentary that was actually about First Lady Hillary Clinton that was set to air, and there were individuals in the United States who said, this is not protected speech. This is a campaign advertisement, if you will, right before an election. A gentleman who worked with Citizens United who wanted to promote the film said, no, this should be protected speech. I should have the opportunity to show this to people who are interested. And he fought this case. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that you cannot, under the First Amendment, limit certain provisions of speech, and that people should be able to give campaign contributions as a protected manner of speech.
Okay. Theo, we should just, in setting you up here, besides writing books and columns up here, you are a joint citizen. You're Canadian and American citizenship. You spent a lot of time in the States. You went to the Republican convention in Minneapolis, wasn't it? Or St. Paul.
We were both there.
Had a hot dog with Ron when I was there.
You were there when Sarah Palin gave the speech about the lipstick on the pig.
Yeah, I was.
Okay. Why is the American electorate so angry today?
Your original question, Steve, was, is it consistent with the American culture? And I would say yes. Remember, Americans rioted because the British put a tax on their breakfast drink, and it wasn't even coffee. And we've seen a revival of that again with the new tea parties. Yes, these are, America is a freedom-minded country that, as Ron said, reacts vociferously and indeed angrily when they think Washington is out of control and some of their liberties are being curtailed. Look, I'm not a lawyer like Ron is, but I think the First Amendment is really straightforward. No, and this is supposed to be a compliment.
Okay.
But I think the First Amendment, when you read it, it's meant to be pretty straightforward. The Citizens United case, I'm surprised we got to it so quickly, but I think Arnie summarized pretty aptly why everyone's been angry the last 10 years. Starting with Florida, perfect.
Yes.
Thank you.
But Citizens United, let me unpack it, and I know you'll read me if I'm going too far afield. The largest single donor in this election cycle in the United States has nothing to do with business, has nothing to do with Citizens United, is the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, a public sector union. That's correct. And they are going to be giving something like $87.5 million, almost 100% of it, to Democratic candidates. So yes, there's anger about Citizens United. And some have suggested, indeed I think it was in today's Wall Street Journal, that the reason there's so much anger is public sector unions are ticked that the other side actually gets to do some contribution this cycle as well. So yeah, the reasons are exactly correct. And I think if you unpack it, you'll find
But isn't it interesting? You can give the actual amount that they are giving. The problem with the Citizens United case is that it's not about transparency. It is not about accountability. There are millions of dollars that are being spent that we cannot track, that we cannot identify. So right now, it's lovely what you're saying, but I'm just telling you, after the fact, we don't know.
Membership has its privileges,
I'm sorry.
and she owns the House, so we got to hear from her first. Okay, you've been I don't mean to date you here, but you've been following politics
a long time,
a little longer than the rest of us here. Have you ever seen it like this before?
There's the decibel is certainly loud, but what's so interesting, Stephen, I think it goes deeper than partisan politics, in honesty, and deeper than who's giving money to whom, and so it's beyond the usual politics. This is the worst recession in the memory of living Americans.
That's right.
Right? Americans have not lived through a recession like this in 70 years. 1 in 7 unemployed. I don't know the latest numbers on foreclosures of people's homes. Who knows? And I don't want to get into right now who's responsible for all this, because that would take us way off topic. But this is a time of huge economic insecurity, which frankly, we in Canada cannot understand. We've experienced nothing like it. It is not surprising with this level of insecurity. And after all, hope and optimism that things would get better. They're not better. In fact, it looks worse. Not worse than what might have happened had we not done, had the United States, had the Obama administration not done what it did. This is really bad for people. I'm not one bit surprised there's anger. People don't know what to do with it. You just said they want everybody gone. Well, you know what? That's not an option. You have to elect somebody to run the government.
Can I just understand this, Ron? Did people think when Barack Obama came in, not even 2 years ago, that he was going to resolve every problem in America in less than 2 years?
No, but here's the difference. He tried to take the electorate to a different place, and I think a place that was not realistic. He campaigned on the notion of hope and change that America can do better, we must do better, which we all believe regardless of our political affiliation. But it was not much on substance. And you look at the substance of how are we going to get out of the greatest recession since, the Great Depression? How are we going to try to get people back to work? Is it the Republican way? Is it the Democrat way? He said it was a nonpartisan way. And I think the manner in which he has governed has been the most partisan administration that we've seen in the United States in over 50 years.
And
I think part of the problem is that it's like, when there's a sucking sound and it gets faster and stronger.
Are you channeling Ross Perot?
It's idea, and the problem was that it was going to get worse before he could make it better. And so instead of this charismatic, incredibly well-spoken man who was fabulous on the stump, he should have taken that and said to the American people, we are going to live the next couple of years, and it's going to be a disaster. But let me tell you why. But it's going to take us time to fix it. But instead, not only did he build himself up to be almost the Messiah,
I agree with that.
But then what happened was, and it did get worse. We have the greatest inequality in this country since probably the 1870s. We have never seen the kind of inequality. And what's worse for us here, Janice, than in Canada, is we don't have a safety net. You lose your job, you lose your health care. You lose your job, you can't send your kid to college. So there is no space to breathe. There's only fear. And everyone is already working. You know, I always said that, you know, in the 70s, the jobs got outsourced, so mom went to work.
Right.
And then after mom went to work, your kid went to work. I kept saying we didn't need marriages, we needed ménage à trois, because it was the only way to survive economically. But that's the case, and that's exactly what's happened. So
Theo?
it is very different.
Theo.
You asked Steve if people thought President Obama was going to solve all the country's problems in 2 years. The answer, I think everyone agrees, is no. However, let's look at what some of those problems are and were. We had a massive deficit because too much spending was done in the previous administration and under the Democratic Congress. We had, what, a $400 billion deficit everyone was upset about. Well, one of the things, maybe people didn't think Obama would solve it all, but they didn't think he would triple that deficit, which is what he and the Democrats have done. And frankly, the Tea Party and the anger that we're going to talk about, these are economic issues that are really getting people worried and frightened. That's what Arnie is saying.
As opposed to the culture wars of the past.
Exactly. And we have seen a lot of cycles of people desperately, opponents of the Tea Party or the Democrats or incumbents who are worried about losing their seats, even Republicans worried about losing their nominations. They have been desperate to make this about something it isn't. It's not about abortion. It's not about cultural issues. It's not about antipathy toward people who are different or whatever people have said about them. These are citizens who are very concerned about the fact that they have 10% of GDP as a deficit now in the United States. Total public debt equal to GDP, unfunded liabilities, depending on which estimates you want to use, somewhere between 60 and 100 trillion with a T dollars. Americans, whatever their elites or Democrats or others want to say about them, or even people in Canada, they can read, they can add, and they do understand that these numbers are unsustainable. And you want to talk about anger, by the way, take a look at France and Greece a few months ago. These are countries that are at the end point of where the United States is now. So these are economic issues, people are angry and, as Arnie said, frightened and hoping that they're going to get solved.
See, I agree with that, and I think it's actually important to make that point that the anger is not only in the United States. We hear so much, right, from the voices echo very loudly.
Excuse me,
France.
it was in Toronto 3 days ago.
That's what I was going to say. Never mind, but let's go to Europe, France, Spain, Italy, and in the UK too, a lot of anger. These are all related to economic insecurity. I don't agree with you that it's about the size of the deficit or it's about the size of the unfunded liability, because people don't get up in the morning and say the United States has an unfunded liability of $1 trillion.
Tea Partiers do that.
Well, not a lot of them, but they do get up in the morning and they say, my house is foreclosed, and you know what? I can't even negotiate it as an asset because they messed up on the paperwork. I tell you, there is a lot of anger when you hear that. In Toronto, where we would not have expected, there is an angry public for the same reason. It's mainly based in a really tough economic environment.
Let me say this. People do wake up in the morning in America and say, we spent $800 billion in a stimulus package that was supposed to, when the president came out with this, said unemployment's at 6.8% right now. If we pass the stimulus package, it's not going to go higher. Now it's at 9.5%. The administration said,
that's
we have
a huge mistake to overpromise.
I agree, but the administration said, we have all of these shovel-ready projects, and if we go ahead and pass this...
Shovel-ready projects, they're never shovel.
And they're never shovel-ready.
No.
And the president a few weeks ago says, well, you know what? There really is no such thing as shovel-ready. So my point is that that's why the American electorate is so distressed and they're so angry. They feel like there was so much hope and change and so much promise, and then the leaders of their government come out and say, you know what? Actually, there's no shovel-ready. The economy is in much worse shape. The unemployment's higher. We didn't really take...
I also think there's another problem here, and the other problem here is that all the anger has been focused on government. And yet when you look at what brought us to our economic knees, I can give you an area code. It's probably Manhattan. It's probably Wall Street. And when you look at people who had 401ks that are now 101ks, when you look at what got bailed out, when you look at, we're now talking about a foreclosure scandal, but before the foreclosure scandal, there was the mortgage scandal. It was the liar loans. And people were buying houses with no documentation, and so you would have thought, well, you should have known to have documentation. No, I'm supposed to trust my banker. I buy one house in a lifetime, but a banker sells houses every day because they write the paper on it. So nobody exercised reason. Everybody made a quick fix. Everybody made profit. The problem is, you will take my home, but you will save that bank.
That's the problem. That's exactly right. But people have the anger with the Congress for not having proper regulation of the banking industry. Well, look, I'm angry at the banks. Look, there never should have been a bank bailout. But my point is, the Democrats were in charge. The Democrats said Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are solvent, they're secure, Barney Frank, the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, said, oh no, these things are fine. Chris Dodd in charge in the Senate.
Let me ask you folks a question.
Yeah.
This is a case of recession. It's a serious financial crisis, which are historically longer, deeper, and tougher to dig your way out of. Everybody knows.
And they get worse
This
every time.
happened in the 1930s. FDR was president. There was a bailout, a massive bailout, massive spending, lifted the economy out of the worst period of it for 3 years.
That's really debatable.
But yeah, I was going to say, some would say that it made it worse.
Wait, but then there was a double dip. And by the way, where was the anger? Where was the anger? So why is it? And it was much worse. It was 25% unemployment in the 1930s. There's 10, 15,
After that bailout
18.
you talked about.
Yeah.
But we are in the internet age, and we are with a much more educated
There was a radio.
electorate.
Oh, come on. There was a radio age, and people knew that
Expectations are
unemployment.
different today? Is that what it is?
I think what we're seeing is the delegitimation of government. Right?
Yes.
And that's
Yes.
the
Absolutely.
fundamental problem. And I think it's a problem for Republicans. I think it's a problem for Democrats.
that's right.
I don't care what your
Theo, let me
political
give you-
affiliation is.
I'm going to read something from your favorite liberal columnist, Charles Krauthammer, here, and then and then I'll give you first shot at this. Here's let's bring this graphic up if we could. Charles Krauthammer in the Washington Post from a few days ago. Conventional wisdom is that the election is being driven by anger and blind anti-incumbent fervor. Nonsense. Overwhelmingly, it is Democratic incumbents, not Republicans, who are under siege. One must understand that anger is the explanation du jour when Republicans win big. Of course, the electorate is angry this time around, but it is not inchoate irrational anger, a temper tantrum, as ABC News anchor Peter Jennings called the 1994 Republican sweep, but a highly pointed, perfectly rational anger at the ideological overreach and incompetence of the governing Democrats. Is this a rational anger to incompetent administration? Is that the way you see it too?
Well, I can't top Dr. Krauthammer. Indeed, that's very similar to what I said at the top of the show. And I wonder if you brought this out just to out me for having quoted him without citing him. But yes, he's right. As I said at the beginning, people have been desperate to call it about one thing and another as opposed to what it actually is. And when Peter Jennings made that remark, I think he meant it. And I think genuinely people look at the Tea Party and they go, oh, they're loud. Oh, they're angry. But the reasons I specified, actually, I think are valid. Because right before I gave my answer, wherein I said, deficits are too high, debt is too high, and unfunded liabilities are too high. Professor, you'll recall that Arnie was saying how afraid everyone is in the United States and losing their house and losing their health care and everything else.
Personal fear.
Well, indeed. And I think that personal fear is informed by saying there will be no Social Security for anybody because simply there won't be. That is a complete shell game. There is no money for those who are paying into it. Medicare has just had $500 billion taken out of it. So older people who need medical care, and this is by the new healthcare reform. So people look on a personal basis at their situation, and as Ron mentioned, we are in the internet age, and so people are cognizant of this broader information, and they realize that this does affect them. And they say, yes, I'm angry, yes, I'm frightened, and deficits and unfunded liabilities and debts are the reason why.
But isn't it interesting that as we're talking about this, Frank Rich wrote a fabulous column in the New York Times this weekend.
I've never uttered that sentence. I've never read that sentence in my life.
Anyway, but one of the things I think also that's got people so angry is that they see the bailout of Wall Street and the banks, and then they find out that they're doing swimmingly well. And he used an example of the CEO of Countrywide. And Countrywide was notorious on the whole mortgage stuff, not Fannie Mae, not Freddie Mac, private Countrywide. And Countrywide took us to our knees. This CEO made $500 million in 8 years, and so he got fined. What did he get fined? $47 million. You know what that means? Crime pays. Because he could bring an economy down, and instead, he didn't do a perp walk. Instead, he walks away with $500 million, and his fine is $47 million. And people are looking, and they're saying, you're taking my house. On a foreclosure, you can't even prove you looked at the documentation. On a mortgage, you probably shouldn't have lent me. On an inflated house, and now I don't have a job. But see, I mean, they're looking at this saying, there's no fairness here.
This is where I think we absolutely agree. And this is why, again, I think the American people are so angry. The American people say, wait, you're going to bail out Wall Street. You're going to bail out these mortgage people. I think President Bush, and I worked for President Bush, made a huge mistake of starting the TARP and starting the bailout, because there should not be such a thing as too big to fail. If you've gone into business and you can't pay your debts, you should fail. The Obama administration came forth after that and said, oh, we're going to continue the TARP. That was the worst idea of fiscal policy I think that we've seen in this country in the last 20 years. They should have failed, and they should have restructured in bankruptcy, they should have consolidated their debts, and they should have moved on. But people say, if I fail, if I can't pay my checkbook, if I can't pay my bank balance, I lose my home.
You know, I understand the feeling, right? And that is fueling the anger that it seems that big guys got off virtually scot-free and all the little people. But in fact, the TARP was not a bad idea. Now, it's very difficult to prove the what-ifs of history, right?
Yes.
And so we can spend the rest. But frankly, when you let big interlinked institutions fail, they drag the whole economy down with you. Look at the TARP. The money that was lent to the big financial institutions, with one exception, has been virtually paid back. So if you look at the impact on the public treasury, that's not where the escalating debt actually is.
You're making a rational argument.
Yes.
And these are irrational times.
Well, no, but I say I do understand why people are furious, because they see what Arnie just talked about, and it doesn't make any sense to them. They're furious.
Correct. Yes. I agree. And I don't want to wreck your reputation, Arnie, when you get back to New Hampshire, but you are making the case against the private sector very, very well. I agree with you in terms of the private sector banks who brought about the meltdown. What it does, I think, is it disregards the government aspect of it. The Fannie Mae, the Community Reinvestment Act loans and all the rest of it.
Community reinvestment had nothing to do with the meltdown. Community reinvestment has been in place for 30 years. We won't get into the weeds. We can't get into the weeds on that.
We're not going to re-legislate.
I promise.
It's not germane, because that's in the past anyway. Let's deal with, now TARP, you're right. The idea of TARP, and this is, by the way, when incumbents, including Republicans who've gotten turfed out of office or lost the nomination fights, they've gone after them for supporting cap and trade, I understand, or for Obamacare. I understand why you go after them for that, or stimulus. But TARP, you can see why a reasonable legislator, even a Republican, would have gone for TARP, because remember how it was sold by Secretary Paulson, with all the pache, your administration, as $700 billion that we would take and buy these horrible mortgage-backed securities that had to be marked to market, so nobody knew what they were worth. If you could have had a paper fix, by the way. If you just got rid of the mark-to-market rules, you would have taken care of it right there. But they didn't. And we'll buy them because the logic being only government can hold these worthless securities long enough for real estate to come back online and for them to regain their value. What happened, and Paulson first and then Tim Geithner after that, was they said, oh, you know, it's too complicated for us to actually do what we told you when we asked for the appropriation from Congress, and so we'll buy preferred shares in the actual companies instead of buying up the lousy mortgage-backed securities which cause this phenomenon whereby somebody, defaults on their mortgage in Boca Raton and Iceland goes up in flames. So it was a good, or at least a defensible idea when it was put forward, but it wasn't how it was executed. It was the execution of TARP that was really the problem. And they did buy $1.3 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities, but it was the Fed that did that. It had nothing to do with TARP. People voted for it.
But here's where the conservatives will disagree.
But that's not what disabled the economy.
No, it's part of a perfect storm. I think you'd agree with that.
But here's where the conservatives will disagree. The way that it was written, the original TARP version that was written, it was only a couple of sentences. I mean, it gave pretty much the Secretary of the Treasury and the administration a blank check.
On the night of the panic.
Right. So when you have a blank check like this, the administration and members of Congress love to spend money. People in the White House love to spend money. So now they've had a situation where they're like, well, even though there's unspent TARP money, we should dedicate it to this purpose. Well, even though it wasn't the original intent, but we're dealing with a fiscal crisis. And as a fiscal conservative, I look at this, Steve, and I say, this is absurd. They passed this thing when they didn't know what they were passing. They didn't recognize what the boundaries of TARP would be. They should have let some of these companies fail. And now we have a situation.
Just so I'm clear, people understand all this intuitively, and therefore that's why they're mad?
No, I see, and here's where I disagree with you. Yes, but it's part, Arnie, of a bigger picture of if it's the TARP, it's Fannie, it's Freddie, it's big guys are getting richer, I'm losing my house, I have no hope, and people are saying, why is it that the fat cats get bailed out and Main Street America doesn't get taken care of?
What we haven't talked about here is that, yes, there are people that get upset about TARP. You know why? Because they watch Fox News 24/7. And Fox News has now decided to define terms. So everyone knows what TARP is, how Fox identifies TARP. Everyone knows about Muslims as O'Reilly identifies Muslims. Everyone knows that becomes the problem. The problem is it real? Does it touch their lives? Maybe not. But if Fox says it touches their lives, it does. We are living in a very different 24/7 cable situation. We have Rupert Murdoch that owns everything, whether it's the Weekly Standard in Washington, whether it's the Wall Street Journal. So as a result, you have information that aids and abets fear on top of an economic downturn. Oh my God, what a cocktail.
How many people watch O'Reilly every night?
6 million.
6 million.
Yeah, small.
4 to 6 million.
So that's exactly
in a country of 300 million people.
2%.
come on. Have you been in a water cooler? One person knows the story. By the time you leave the office, the whole entire office knows the story.
Well, actually,
they define the terms. They set the agenda. And as a result, because of that, I know that. Yeah. Because of that, that's why it makes a difference. 6 million is all you need to change a conversation in the country.
Well, actually, that's not true. I mean, I disagree with Arnie there. What's interesting, you're right that this is a 24/7 news universe. But what do we actually know? What does the research actually tell us? Something is actually disturbing if you're interested in politics. People are reading the websites and watching the programs that they already agree with.
That's
right. And that's across the political spectrum. So there's actually, unlike when you watch the agenda and you have your views challenged by people that you don't necessarily agree with, and you might learn something as a result of that, what we're actually seeing in the 24/7 news cycle that Art's talking about, people's pre-existing views are getting reinforced.
That's right.
And
on both sides.
On all sides.
Yeah.
So actually,
for liberals
that's
on MSNBC,
for liberals
for conservatives
and
on
for
Fox.
conservatives,
Yes.
exactly.
wanna...
And that's pushing the anger up, because they never hear anything that shades their views a little bit. I think that's a big part of this.
I think you're right about that, and I think at least on the left it's fairly new, because decades ago you could never leave the island of Manhattan and everyone would think the exact same thing. But what you described, certainly it can exist on the right, and I don't want to wreck your street cred as well as Arnie's by saying to you that Joni Goldberg, a conservative columnist, wrote something very much like what you're saying
he did.
during the Juan Williams imbroglio that happened recently, where he was fired by NPR, and Joni Goldberg, this conservative columnist, said, you know, I listen to NPR, and the reason is precisely as Professor Stein just said, because otherwise you find yourself in an echo chamber hearing people who only agree with you. Now, I'm very fortunate. I spend most of my time in Toronto and Washington, D.C., and nobody agrees with me, so I'm able to hear other points of view, but it's a point well taken.
But it's a big issue.
Yeah.
Let me, we're about 8:30 here, so let me do a little business with the folks at home. We are exploring why the American electorate is so angry. We're down here at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the downtown campus of the University of Toronto. Our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is standing by. He's hosting a live chat right now on our Inside Agenda page. That's tvo.org/the-agenda. Look for the Inside Agenda blog there, and you can dial us up and participate in that live chat. It's also happening on our Facebook page, if you prefer that route, facebook.com/the-agenda. And we want to remind you that once we're off television at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, we go exclusively online on our homepage, tvo.org/the-agenda, where we'll take your comments and questions for our four guests for 10 or 15 minutes after we get off the air. Once again, all of that happening online, tvo.org/the-agenda. Let's do this Jonathan Chait New Republic graphic next if we can. Okay. Let me read this and that'll spark some conversation here. Tyler Cowen of the New York Times makes an interesting point. Countries have had success in cutting spending when the public trusts the government.
That's right.
Distrust of government makes Americans distrust everything people in government say or do, including cut spending. Democratic control of government during an economic crisis has indeed made the party's favorability sink to GOP-esque levels, but this will hardly help Republicans carry out a small government agenda if and when they take power as a result. If they try, they will probably run into the same buzzsaw that destroyed them in 1995. Janice, let me go to you first on this. How much of this strategy of turning people off, those currently in government, ultimately means we hate them all, doesn't matter what party, we're not going to trust anybody again, ever?
That's where I started tonight. That's a very, very dangerous strategy. It's kind of short-termism. You attack, you delegitimate. We have some of that stuff going on in Canada, right? Our own politics in Ottawa are much more partisan than they would have been a decade ago. The attacks are more personal. But what that does in the end is work to the disadvantage of everybody. I think Jonathan Chait's quite right. You delegitimate government, you delegitimate the principal parties, and ultimately the public gets to a point where they say it doesn't matter who's in office, they're all bums, as Arnie said, they're all crooks, and we don't trust anything that our government wants to do.
But see, I think there's hope from this. I think there's hope from this because I think this election cycle is going to be a two-pronged cycle. I think starting in 2010, there's going to be a massive shift to the electorate. I think a number of incumbents are going to be thrown out of office. I think there are a lot of incumbents who thought, I'm in a safe seat, are going to find themselves out. But then in 2012, I think this realignment will happen. I mean, again, we saw this in the middle part of the 90s. And I think in America, maybe it's a 12-year cycle. It's People get in, they're new people, they're trying to deal with their constituents, and all of a sudden they start to get entrenched and used to the ways of Washington. But I think now what you're going to see is a brand new crop. I predict, the Ron Christie prediction, that you're going to have somewhere between 52 to 56 new members of Congress who are in the Republican majority. And then in the next cycle, Republicans take over the House. And then in the next cycle, you have 24 Democrats that are going to try to hold their seats in the 2012 election cycle. I think that's going to be very difficult. I think the Republicans will take over the Senate in 2012. So with a new realignment and in a presidential year, I think people are going to say, okay, we're going to give the new government a chance. We'll see if they can get it done, and it will start again the cycle once more.
What are you going to do, Ron, in 2 years? I mean, we're talking about Barack Obama. Gee, look what he didn't accomplish in 2 years. Of course, we know he accomplished a lot, but there's a sense of dissatisfaction because we still have high unemployment. We still are looking at some large deficit numbers. We really don't know what health care reform looks like because it's not going to happen until 2014. So if Republicans get in control, what the H are they going to do? And the reason I ask that is that so many of the Tea Party people and so many groups are asking these potentially new members of Congress to sign statements about what they won't do, that you will defund Obamacare, that you will not work in concert with Democrats. They're literally having them sign statements, not just making some platitude when they're running for office, because you know you can never trust that, because they want it in blood. Governing is about conversation. Governing is about, it is. It's about compromise, and we've forgotten.
This is perfect, because I got a graphic here that will speak to this very thing. We'll play that, and then we'll come here. Here's Eric Erickson, editor-in-chief of RedState.com. I don't want compromise. I want people who will fight for principle. I know President Obama will still be in the White House for 2 more years, and Democrats in the Senate will have a filibuster to stall our agenda, but I don't want people who give up before the battle has been had. Obama is a fighter. If our guys are compromisers, they lose. Fighters always beat compromisers. The lesson from this election should be the following. Fight. Now, you're all shaking your head.
That's just wrong.
You're all shaking your head.
We'll defer to the host.
But there does, all right, Theo, to you first. There does seem to be a spirit in the land of fight, whereas the word compromise, which
dirty word,
seems to be a dirty word these days. Would you not agree?
Probably you're right. I wouldn't have written that, but I would
good.
But I would say that the point of government is good governance. I'm an affable guy. I try to be anyway. I'd like to get along. I'd like to have compromise. And I got to believe that most people in both parties who are running in this election cycle feel the same way. Yes, you'd like that. But ideally, you go to Washington to do the very best you can for the citizens who sent you there. Now, if you don't believe something is right for the country, and we hear about how Obama accomplished an awful lot, well, there are a lot of people who don't think the things that he accomplished, like the new health care bill, are good for the country.
John Boehner said, "This is not a time for compromise, and I can tell you that we will not compromise on our principles." This is the guy who will be, if Ron is right, the next Speaker of the House of Representatives.
The greatest successes in history are, in fact, committed by people who are fundamental believers in their own principles and unwilling to listen and see any truth whatsoever on the other side of the house.
Right.
That's when we've had the greatest catastrophes in the 20th century. Politics is all about the art of the possible. Governing is about the art of the possible. And the truth is usually on both sides of the aisle, not on one.
Here's where I'm going to take the unpopular stand to agree with my friend John Boehner. I think he's right. I think we should not bend on our principles. I don't think the president should bend on his principles. But you need to have principled discussions with members who are in government. Yeah. Democrats can have principled positions about what they believe. Republicans can have principled positions about what they believe. But then they need to find the center. Right. You get a little bit of what you want. I get a little bit of what I want.
I feel like I'm in La La Land. And let me tell you why I feel like I'm in La La Land. Because Obamacare is actually almost a dream for Republicans, because if you look at all the principles in Obamacare, it is things that Republicans have been asking for the last decade. They didn't want a public option. They wanted the private sector in. We did. We now have an insurance company between every doctor and every patient for everyone. We didn't want to compromise. So much of what Barack Obama did, which, trust me, I am from the left, they're so disgusted with what he did, because what he did was exactly what Republicans have been asking for 10 years. So Republicans get the best of both worlds. They get the care they wanted, and they get to demonize the care if it doesn't work.
Well,
I love it. It's the perfect solution.
The La La Land was, this was premised on, we were going to have affordable care. People were going to be able to keep the health care that they have.
It's not 2014.
Premiums weren't going to go up, and in fact, this would reduce the deficit. What we have found now is that after passage of Obamacare, less people in the United States have health insurance than before passage of the bill. The facts of the matter are, the Democrats say that the Republicans tried to demonize on this issue. The Democrats took $500 billion out of the Medicare program.
Does the bill go into effect by 2014, and are people unemployed?
I didn't interrupt you. My point here is a serious one. The Democrats, everything that they promised on this bill, Arnie, none of it has come true. None of it has come true. And they keep saying, wait until 2014. The fact of the matter is, when you try to add an entitlement system to a government that is bankrupt and is broke, and you're going to say you can have everything for less and it's going to reduce the deficit, Americans are angry when they find that it hasn't come true.
Here's the issue, okay? For anybody, if a Republican had won 2 years ago, the economy is in free fall. Yeah. There is already a huge deficit which comes from the previous president, all right, who fought wars and didn't raise taxes. In fact, cut taxes.
And raise revenues.
Yeah.
Increased revenues by $700 billion between 2014
was not enough to cover the deficit. You would agree.
48 months of economic growth, which is the second highest since World War II.
So we're in a hole. And what you need to do is pull the economy out, but you don't get that done in 2 years. So you're postponing gratification. It doesn't matter who it is. If you pass any kind of health care reform, which wherever you are on the political spectrum, it takes 2 or 3 years. So you have a president who finds himself, who frankly wasn't honest, and that was the point we made at the beginning of the show, wasn't honest with people and said, health care reform, don't count it now, it's coming 4 or 5 years. That's a long time in politics. Exactly. And people get frustrated and angry.
I restate my commitment to affability and compromise. I think it's important where you can find it. But I will suggest,
you have to look really hard.
You have to say something, my friend.
I would like to say, though, that I think we should be careful of that phenomenon whereby compromise means Republicans do what Democrats want. I mean, even you, with all due respect, you read that quote from John Boehner with what sounded like a Nixon impression. The idea being that he hasn't done what the Republicans do. Well, what has the president done to compromise with Republicans in Congress?
Got rid of the public option?
Well, fine, but they weren't involved in the health care reform in any respect. In fact, to get rid of the health care reform was to get Democrats to vote for his bill. It had nothing to do with getting Republicans, because they didn't.
That's true. It's to get
because they didn't vote for the bill. Or what about his stimulus plan? Nothing. He just said this week in Seattle, the president just said this week in Seattle, how Republicans can come for the ride, but they got to sit in the back seat. Is this the spirit of compromise?
No.
No, I don't mean to score a point, but I do want to say that, to your point, Professor, it's both parties, if you want compromise, to have to do it. It's not just John Boehner has to do what Nancy Pelosi wants him to do.
I completely agree with you. I said compromise comes on both sides of the aisle, and you look for the center.
And how?
Ron, you wanted to add on that?
The only thing I was going to add, and this is a little bit far afield for what we've been discussing, but I think there's also an element that we've seen with this president that we haven't seen with others, where he picks winners and losers and he demonizes those that he disagrees with. You mentioned, Theo, where he said Republicans, you know, when he was speaking to a group of Hispanics, he said Republicans will let them sit in the car, but they have to sit in the back. For an African-American president to make the notion of Rosa Parks, or making the illusion of the bravery that she displayed of sitting on that bus and refusing to yield her seat, but now the black president, the first one in the United States, is going to tell Republicans to sit in the back of the bus, the racial tension that is mounting in America is palpable, and it is palpable to me. It's palpable.
It's really a very, very unfortunate and insensitive choice of words. Let's say stupid.
Yeah, I would.
But Theo, when did the Republicans, when did they really want to come to the table? Wasn't it from the very beginning? See, the problem is, I think from the very beginning, the agenda was to figure out for the next 2 years what they were going to do to get back control of Congress. I think that they did not want to compromise. They knew they had made a mistake. They knew that the Bush years were a disaster. That everything
I would take exception.
Well, I think on many levels they realized that there was such a financial mess that they had left the country in. But the question is, did they ever have the idea that they were going to roll up their sleeves and work on this together? Tell me what it was.
The answer is yes. And I'll give you a couple quick examples. First, you said that they've spent the last 2 years just planning on how they're going to take back control. I don't think anyone thought 2 years ago, after Obama rolled into office and we lost both chambers of Congress, that the Republicans were going to take back control. I think I mentioned maybe a year ago that Republicans might win the House, and everyone looked at me like I was a crazier than they normally think that I am. Paul Ryan, the congressman from Wisconsin. He's going to be sort of the pivot on the budget. He's had some tremendous ideas. He's got a roadmap for the tax. The Republicans offered an alternative health care plan, which you're going to hear about again after the election. They certainly had a plan for the stimulus, and they have asked at least to pass a budget, which Congress has left town without doing before the election. They've asked to have a discussion at least about what the tax rates are going to be on January 1st, and the Democrats haven't had that either. So they've come to the table from taxes, they've come with stimulus, they've come with health care. And yes, we keep hearing of the party of no with no ideas in the last 2 years.
There's nothing specific. They also say they're going to cut billions of dollars to waste, fraud, and inefficiency from the U.S. government, and they're asked for an example, and they don't say a thing.
Okay, everyone always says that, Steve, but let me go to the healthcare thing.
Last word on this, because we got an audience.
There's one last thing on healthcare that's important. Republicans said there's a reason why insurance companies have a certain monopoly, and that's that you're not allowed to buy insurance across state lines. Yeah. Here's a constructive idea. Why don't we have a system where you can buy insurance across state lines to allow people to pool together, to bring down premium costs and allow more options? And of course, the Democrats said no.
Or even tort reform. And Howard Dean agreed with us on that one,
Host is jumping in here because the audience wants in. Hi, you're our first question tonight.
My name's Sonny Young, and the question is for Theo. It relates to the changeover, and would the libertarians and conservative types go bonkers when the House goes Republican and the Senate remains Democrat?
The question is, will they go bonkers? I don't think they'll go bonkers. And but that's obviously a relative term, bonkers. It's a relative scientific, highly political term. I'm sure you study a bonkers thing. You know, I don't think they will. I think people have measured expectations. I think all of us agree that the Republicans are going to win the House. And to quickly deal with 1995, Jonathan Chait's quotation that you had, the Republicans didn't fail last time they took the House. They actually balanced the budget and passed welfare reform when Bill Clinton got the credit, and that's fine. I think they'll try to do some pretty good things, and I think, as Ron said, they'll look towards 2012 and maybe have some more substantial gains in 2 years' time.
You know, just to follow up on what Theo said, actually Republican control of the House with the Democratic president has usually been a recipe for compromise.
But Professor, here's going to be the big thing. Can Obama, is he adroit politically enough? Can he pivot like Bill Clinton did in 1995 and recognize I have a chance to get a lot of my agenda through?
I feel for Barack Obama because Bill Clinton did not have the House members that Barack Obama may get. You had the Tea Party operating in the primary, eliminating very, very successful, moderate, reasonable, conciliatory individuals from the Republican group, and they have now emerged on the scene. And the question is, how are they going to change Republicans in Congress? It is going to be a very different Congress.
Unlike anything we've ever seen before. To snuggle up to? Are you saying that he was a...
Gingrich is the policy wonk. Yeah. He fell in love with Bill Clinton. Yeah, the problem is the Tea Party folks that are going to be elected on Tuesday, they have a very different agenda. Yeah. And the problem is, a friend of mine said to me before I came here, he said, just remember, people that despise government govern despicably. Remember that.
Well, that's catchy. Anyway.
Back here, please.
I'm going to quote my mother, who came from a much scarier place, Poland, in 1930, and she said, never underestimate the power of hatred. And one of the things that I always thought was very interesting when I hear people in these meetings is that how personal the attacks become and group. I was actually playing golf with the Secretary of State of Louisiana the week before Katrina hit. The late Fox McEachern and I, being the ugly Canadian, and we're the eunuchs in the harem, we get to watch everything and have no effect whatsoever. And I asked him, what would it take to get health care through the Congress? And having drunk about 12 bottles of beer and his golf was getting better, he said to me, I'll deny I ever said this, but if I could promise my poor white farmers that no black people would ever get it, I'd get it through the House in 5 minutes. And I'm wondering how much race is actually playing into this anger.
Thank you for that. From where we sit up here, Ron, it looks like you can't have a discussion with somebody in the United States unless you're prepared to call them Hitler. We're seeing a lot of that these days, right? Where did this idea come from, that in order to have a disagreement with somebody, you had to call him Hitler or Stalin or the second coming of Karl Marx or that kind of thing?
Well, I'd take it a different way, Steve. I have been distressed. One of the things that I held high promise for the election of Barack Obama was that America was truly striving to become a post-racial country, that we had shattered for the first time the glass ceiling that said an ethnic minority, someone who was half black, half white, with a very interesting and very promising background could become president. But unfortunately, the debate has devolved into, if you disagree with President Obama, you're racist. If you don't like health care, you're racist. If you have any tangible disagreement with this administration, you're racist. And it's not just, oh, it's those Republicans, but you hear about the Tea Party, and I think Arnie's emotion touched on this earlier. There's such an emotion about, oh, the Tea Party, they're racist, they're this. You see people going to Democratic rallies who have crazy things. When I worked for the president, people would burn his face in effigy. They would go to his front lawn. They would say these terrible things.
This
but the media,
43.
this is Bush 43. But people didn't really report about that. But you have one nut with a sign at a Tea Party rally when everyone else's was very peaceful, and all of a sudden, Tea Party is racist. The interjection of racial politics and presidential politics is unlike anything I think that we've all collectively seen in our lifetimes. And yes, he is black, he did win, but you can have a substantive policy disagreement with a man without having a problem with his race.
Yeah, I think you're right in principle, but I don't think you're right in practice. I think I agree with the questioner. There is a subtext that runs through, that comes out, and it comes out in ugly ways, and again, on both sides, right? So we were just talking about the stupid comment that Barack Obama made.
Right.
Because there is this strain of racial tension, you alluded to it, which I think comes with having the first African-American president in the White House, again, in extraordinarily tough economic times, which plays into insecurity, and that's the default place, and that's where you go. And I think it's naive
But
to
I
think,
disagree with that. He won. He won with independents, he won with women, he won with Hispanics, and now to say that less than 2 years later that somehow
of course he won, but even the fact that he won doesn't eliminate that underlying threat of racism that was present in the electorate. And it's worse now because it's much worse now, and you said it yourself, because people feel so insecure and angry. Where do they go? To that.
He won
I agree.
to fix it. It's not about winning. Winning is not the issue. It's about during his tenure, people imagined that it would be different and that it would happen sooner. I don't think they completely comprehended the enormity of the problem. No one ever took the time to explain it. And so it's very easy to blame government, because when a congressperson comes in, the first thing I hear in a conversation, where's my job? Well, wait a minute, you just told me government doesn't create jobs. But yet when the congressman shows up, where's my job? No, you're supposed to ask the CEO that question. You're not supposed to ask me that question.
Right.
So the problem is that government now has become the target of everything. And Barack Obama, being in the position he's in, it's very easy to use the black card, use the fact that he promised us everything, but the economy has not returned. And people are just so angry about that. But I have a question, and that is, every time they do polls, they ask about the disgust with government. I want a poll question to say, what about banks? What about corporations? Why do they have a license to take profit at the expense of a country?
Okay,
why do they have a license? That's what I'm waiting for.
Theo on this, please.
Sure, I'll quickly answer your question. I think the polls would be very similar. I think Steve and I have done a show about the vampire squid that is Goldman Sachs, so I think a lot of us would agree with you on that, Arnie. So I don't think you're a voice in the wilderness. Look, we quoted Barack Obama in Seattle. We didn't quote him on Univision. And as I'm sure everybody on this panel knows, this week on Univision, he said in this cycle, if Latinos don't come out and punish their enemies at the polls, this is, you're right, excuse me a second, you're right, he was elected, Arnie, to solve it in some measure. This is a man who stood at the 2004 Democratic National Convention and said, there is no black America, there's no white America, there's no Latino America, there's no red state, there's no blue state, we're the United States of America. God, I'd like to believe that. It is 2010, for God's sake, can we treat people simply as people?
Yeah, but the problem is that he has to set the tone. The President of the United States sets the tone, and you look at the tone that was set in February when he first came into office. You have an Attorney General of the United States that says America on race has been a nation of cowards. You have the President of the United States who follows up a few months later and says, well, the Cambridge police officer was acting stupidly. Then you have a few months later, it's like again and again and again, the President interjected himself in areas that he should not, as the leader of all Americans, regardless of their race, their ethnic, or their gender. He's the American president, but instead, he inflamed the passions of people. Like, what do you mean we're a nation of cowards? What do you mean they acted stupidly? What do you mean we have a teachable moment?
Let me jump in, Ron, because we've got time for one more question in the back here. Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Patrick Tito. My question, well, actually, we heard a lot of words like fear, irrationality, and chaos, pretty much emotionally. But after fear, there usually comes rational thought. When do you think the American electorate is going to have that rational thought and that discourse that is going to provide policy that is going to be effective for the American people?
Arnie, when's it coming?
Well, he's assuming that it's fear. And when I was called, I said that we're not living in fearful times. I really do believe that the American electorate is having a tantrum. And when you have a tantrum, facts don't matter. You can't talk to your 3-year-old that's flailing like this because it doesn't matter. Nothing will change until they're exhausting themselves. The problem is when you exhaust a nation, what are the results? And I think that's what's so frightening, is that if you don't trust government, and technically government is supposed to be you, and the economy is in free fall, and there's nowhere to turn, who do you trust? Do you trust Google, who just managed to not pay billions of dollars worth of taxes? Do you trust the government, who didn't create the kind of economic landscape? I think the problem right now is I don't know how we get to that conversation. That's what frightens me. I don't know where we go.
Janice, what do you think all this anger could mean to us here in Canada, all this American anger?
Well, we're not immune. We'd like to tell ourselves that we are, but we're not immune. And certainly in this city, in Toronto, we had an angry electorate, and we had a mayor campaign on cutting government spending and cutting the staff, size of the civil service at City Hall, and stopping, stupid spending and returning government to its proper size. So it was fundamentally on an agenda which says, we don't trust government. We want government out of your face. In Canada, generically, we're usually 3 or 4 years behind the United States. So I think we need to pay very close attention to what's happening in the United States. We need to take it very seriously, and we need to work very hard in this country to ask our political leaders to tone the rhetoric down.
Yeah, that's on.
That's on. Well, but there are ways of the electorate speaking up and saying, we're not interested in this Hitler discussion. We're really not. That's not who we are. And if you're going to play that game, we're not interested in you.
Theo, tell me this. Do you see America going forward becoming more isolationist as a result of all of what we've talked about tonight?
No, because first of all, as I think we stipulated, the Republicans are going to win at least the House of Representatives on Tuesday. Generally speaking, Republicans are free traders and Democrats are not. There are lots of reasons we could go into if we had more time. I don't think we do. But from a trade basis, which is what matters principally to Canada, no, they won't become more isolationist. They'll become less so. They'll become less beholden to unions domestically, and just as a general matter of economic principle, they will become less so. In terms of interventionism, foreign wars, and that sort of thing, I think what we found with Barack Obama as president, taking over from George W. Bush, is that sometimes when you have an issue that's a real tough one, like say Afghanistan, no matter what party the president comes from, he's going to have to make some tough decisions, and a lot of them you're not even going to know about.
Ron, a minute left here. You see the Tea Partiers as free traders?
I do.
You do?
And I do, and I take, I'll give my last minute of, there was a question of, are we going to get back to our rationality? I think Americans are rational. I think Americans have recognized that their government is no longer responsive. Their government is no longer listening to them, and their government, frankly, is out of control by the size of spending, by the manner in which they've just elected to govern. We needed jobs in the United States. We needed an economy back on stable footing, and the Democratic majority focused on health care, and they focused on cap and trade. And I think the rationality that we will see in 5 days and we'll see in 2 years is the American electorate are going to put in people who are responsive of getting the jobs and getting the economy back in order, and America will again be the strongest economy in the world.
Let me save 30 seconds for Arnie Arneson to finish us up here.
I think the Republican Party that you described may not be the Republican Party that shows up on Tuesday. And so the best of times for the Republicans will be Tuesday because the Tea Party will have been successful. The worst of times for Republicans will be Tuesday because it's not an agenda to govern. Because you can't govern if you can't converse. You can't govern if you don't believe in government. And the problem is there will be enough of a toxic mix within the Republican Party that it will castrate Republicans from governing. It's going to be a different party. The question is, will that party still exist in 2012?
Stay tuned, everybody. We're done on television, but we're not done yet tonight. I want to thank our guests for coming from Washington and New England and 2 subway stops away and,
Right here.
and her office right next door for participating in our discussion tonight. I want to thank our audience who dialed us up at tvo.org/theagenda, got tickets, and came and shared some of their questions with us tonight. We're grateful you could spare some time for us. For more information about tonight's guests and to read some of the articles that we quoted in tonight's program, please visit us online at tvo.org/theagenda. Tonight's program was produced by Daniel Kitts. Thanks, Daniel. You can catch a replay of our live chat on our Inside Agenda Producers blog, also on the homepage.